Hey everyone, and welcome back to another evening of historical exploration together. Tonight, we're diving deep into a remarkable paradox from ancient Athens, how a city that invented democracy managed to create one of history's most sophisticated systems of public finance, while simultaneously excluding most of its population from the very process that governed their lives. Before we begin our journey, I'd love it if you could give this video a like if these deep dives into forgotten civilizations resonate with you. And please share in the comments where in the world you're joining us from tonight and what time it is where you are. There's something truly special about how our global community comes together in these quiet hours to explore the complexities of human civilization. Now, settle in comfortably, perhaps adjust your pillows, and let the day's concerns fade away. Tonight, we're not seeking dramatic narratives or heroic tales. Instead, we're going to examine something far more subtle yet equally profound: the intricate machinery of Athenian public finance and how ordinary citizens wielded extraordinary power over their city's resources. Let's begin our gentle journey into the heart of democratic budgeting in ancient Athens. Picture yourself walking through the Agora on a cool morning in 430 BCE. The marble stones still damp with dew. The air carries the scent of fresh bread from the bakeries and the distant sound of hammers from the metalworking shops. But today is different. Today is an assembly day, and you can feel the anticipation building as citizens begin to gather, their harmations draped carefully over their shoulders, some carrying small wax tablets for taking notes. These are not the wealthy elites alone, but farmers whose hands still bear the calluses of their labor, craftsmen with clay under their fingernails, and merchants who know the weight of every coin. They are walking toward the Pnyx, that hillside amphitheater carved into the rock where the future of their city's finances will be debated and decided. The Athenian democracy was built on a foundation that seems almost impossible to us today: direct participation by every citizen in the most detailed aspects of government finance. When we think about modern democratic budgeting, it's a process handled by representatives, specialists, and bureaucrats. But in Athens, the citizens themselves would gather to debate whether to spend 2 talents on ship repairs or 3 talents on a new fountain house. They would argue about the cost of feeding the rowers in the navy, the salaries of the night watchmen, and the proper amount to spend on the annual religious festivals. This wasn't symbolic democracy. This was democracy in its most practical, hands-on form. The financial architecture of Athens was deeply intertwined with its military needs and religious obligations. The city's wealth came from multiple sources: the tribute paid by allied cities in the Delian League, the silver mines at Laurion, worked by thousands of slaves, taxes on trade flowing through the Piraeus harbor, and the rents collected from public lands. But managing these resources required a level of administrative sophistication that challenges our assumptions about ancient governmental capacity. The Athenians developed a complex system of financial officials, from the Hellenotamiai, who managed the allied tribute, to the Tamiai, who oversaw the sacred treasuries, each with specific responsibilities and strict accountability to the citizen assembly. Consider the morning when the assembly would convene to discuss the upcoming year's military budget. The Prytanes, the 50 citizens serving as the executive committee for their tribe's rotation, would have already met to set the agenda. They might begin by hearing from the strategoi, the 10 elected generals, about the naval situation in the Aegean. One general might stand to argue that the city needed to increase the number of triremes in active service from 150 to 200, explaining in detail the cost of each ship's maintenance, the wages for the crew of 170 men per vessel, and the provisions needed for extended campaigns. Another might counter that the city's finances were already stretched thin, pointing to the recent expenses for the Parthenon construction and the ongoing costs of the dramatic festivals. The assembly hall itself was a marvel of democratic engineering. The Pnyx, that semicircular amphitheater carved into the hill roadside southwest of the Acropolis, could accommodate roughly 6,000 citizens, a significant portion of the adult male citizen population. The acoustics were carefully designed so that a speaker standing at the central bema could be heard clearly by citizens sitting in the uppermost rows. The orientation of the seating faced north toward the Acropolis and the city center, creating a visual reminder of what the citizens were there to govern. On clear days, they could see the Parthenon rising above them, its marble columns gleaming in the sunlight, a tangible symbol of their collective achievements and the wealth they were gathered to allocate. The physical experience of attending an assembly meeting was both democratic and hierarchical in subtle ways. While there were no reserved seats based on wealth or family status, the natural dynamics of the space meant that those who arrived early could choose the best vantage points. The wealthy, who didn't need to work daily for wages, often had the luxury of arriving early and staying for the full proceedings. The farmers and craftsmen, whose livelihoods depended on daily labor, might arrive later and leave earlier, their participation constrained by economic necessity. This tension between democratic ideals and economic reality permeated every aspect of Athenian financial governance. The morning would begin with religious rituals, offerings to the gods, purification ceremonies, and prayers for divine guidance in the day's deliberations. These weren't mere formalities, but essential components of the democratic process. The Athenians believed that their decisions about public finance required divine approval and protection. A priest would sacrifice a pig and examine its entrails for omens, and only if the signs were favorable would the assembly proceed with its business. This integration of sacred and secular authority reflected the Athenian understanding that their wealth ultimately belonged to the gods, particularly Athena, and that they served as stewards rather than owners of the city's resources. Once the religious preliminaries were complete, the herald would call for speakers on the first item of business. The process was remarkably open. Any citizen could rise to address the assembly regardless of his wealth, family background, or previous political experience. However, the reality was that effective public speaking required education, leisure time for preparation, and the confidence that came from social status. The result was that while the system was theoretically democratic, practical influence was concentrated among those with the resources to develop and exercise rhetorical skills. The financial debates themselves revealed the extraordinary level of detail that characterized Athenian democratic governance. Consider a typical discussion about naval expenditures. The assembly might hear from the naval architect about the technical specifications required for new triremes, the quality of timber needed, the bronze fittings required, the sailcloth specifications. They would debate the relative merits of different suppliers, the costs of transporting materials from various locations, and the timeline for construction. Citizens would question why Macedonian timber cost more than Thracian wood, whether the additional expense was justified by superior quality, and how the choice of materials would affect the ship's performance in different weather conditions. These discussions weren't conducted in general terms, but with specific attention to costs and benefits. A citizen might rise to point out that the proposed naval budget would require an additional eisphora, the emergency property tax, of 2 talents spread among the wealthiest 200 citizens. Another might argue that the cost could be reduced by requiring the triarchs, the wealthy citizens responsible for outfitting individual ships, to contribute more toward basic equipment. A third might suggest that some of the expense could be deferred by extending the service life of existing vessels through more intensive maintenance. The Assembly's approach to religious expenditures provides another window into their budgetary process. The great festivals that punctuated the Athenian calendar, the Panathenaea, the Dionysia, the Thesmophoria, required enormous investments of public resources. The Panathenaic procession alone involved hundreds of participants, elaborate costumes, sacrificial animals, musical performances, and athletic competitions. The Assembly would debate not just the total allocation for these festivals, but the specific components of each celebration. They might spend hours discussing whether the prize for the winner of the tragic competition should be increased from 1,000 drachmas to 1,200, or whether the city should purchase 100 cattle for the sacrificial feast, or make do with 80. These religious expenditures served multiple functions beyond their obvious spiritual purposes. The festivals provided entertainment and social cohesion for the citizen body, creating shared experiences that reinforced civic identity. They also served diplomatic functions, as visitors from other Greek cities would witness Athenian prosperity and power through the magnificence of the celebrations. The free distribution of sacrificial meat provided tangible benefits to ordinary citizens, supplementing their diet with high-quality protein they might not otherwise afford. The Assembly's debates about festival budgets thus involved complex calculations about religion, politics, diplomacy, and social welfare. The tribute system that provided much of Athens' wealth created ongoing tensions in the Assembly's financial deliberations. The Delian League, originally formed as a mutual defense alliance against Persian aggression, had evolved into an Athenian empire. The tribute payments from allied cities provided the financial foundation for Athenian democracy, funding everything from naval construction to public buildings to citizen stipends. Yet this wealth came at the cost of other Greeks' freedom and autonomy, a contradiction that Athenian citizens had to navigate in their public discourse. The Assembly's discussions of tribute policy revealed sophisticated understanding of both economics and politics. Citizens would debate whether to increase tribute assessments for prosperous allied cities, recognizing that higher demands might provoke rebellion, but also that the city's growing expenses required additional revenue. They would consider the administrative costs of tribute collection, the military expenses required to enforce payment, and the diplomatic consequences of harsh treatment of allied cities. Some speakers might argue for leniency towards cities experiencing economic hardship, while others might insist that consistent enforcement was necessary to maintain the integrity of the tribute system. The Laurian silver mines presented another moral complexity in Athenian finance. These mines, worked by thousands of slaves under brutal conditions, provided the silver that backed Athenian currency and funded public expenditures. The Assembly would regularly debate policies related to mining operations, whether to lease additional sections to private operators, how to invest profits from the mines, and what safety standards to require. Citizens were fully aware that their democratic participation was subsidized by slave labor, yet they found various ways to rationalize this arrangement within their political discourse. The leasing system for the mines reflected the Athenian approach to public-private partnerships in resource management. The state owned the mines, but leased extraction rights to private entrepreneurs who provided the capital, expertise, and slave labor required for operations. The Assembly would debate the terms of these leases, the percentage of profits to be paid to the state, the minimum production requirements, the environmental standards to be maintained. These discussions revealed sophisticated understanding of contract law, resource management, and the relationship between public ownership and private operation. The daily administration of Athenian finances required a complex bureaucracy that the Assembly had to fund and oversee. The city employed hundreds of officials, from the prestigious treasurers of Athena to the humble market inspectors who verified weights and measures. Each category of official had specific duties, term limits, and accountability mechanisms. The Assembly would debate their salaries, the qualifications required for appointment, and the procedures for auditing their performance. The challenge was to provide adequate compensation to attract competent officials while preventing the development of a professional political class that might threaten democratic governance. The Athenian approach to public works projects illustrates another dimension of their budgetary process. The construction of the Parthenon, completed in 438 BCE, required enormous expenditures over more than a decade. The Assembly had to approve not just the initial construction, but ongoing allocations for materials, labor, and artistic decoration. Citizens would debate the quality of marble to be used, the wages to be paid to skilled craftsmen, and the timeline for completion. They would question whether the expense was justified by the building's religious and civic functions, or whether the money might be better spent on military preparations or public welfare. These public works debates revealed tensions between different conceptions of the public good. Some citizens argued that magnificent buildings enhanced the city's prestige and provided lasting benefits for future generations. Others contended that the money would be better spent on immediate needs, like naval construction or food distribution. Still others worried that lavish expenditures on public buildings created opportunities for corruption and diverted resources from more practical purposes. The Assembly had to balance these competing priorities while maintaining accountability for the vast sums involved. The winter months brought different challenges to Athenian public finance. With military campaigns suspended and trade reduced, the city's revenues naturally declined. The Assembly had to plan for these seasonal fluctuations, maintaining reserves sufficient to cover essential expenses during the lean months. They would debate the size of the strategic reserve, the priorities for winter spending, and the mechanisms for ensuring adequate food supplies during times of scarcity. These discussions required long-term thinking about resource management and risk assessment. The Assembly's approach to emergency finance reveals another aspect of democratic budgeting. When Athens faced unexpected military threats, natural disasters, or economic crises, the normal budgetary procedures had to be adapted to respond quickly to changing circumstances. The Icephora system allowed the city to raise substantial additional revenues by taxing wealthy citizens. But even these emergency measures required democratic approval. The Assembly would convene special sessions to debate the scope of the crisis, the resources needed to address it, and the fairest methods for raising additional funds. During the Peloponnesian War, these emergency sessions became increasingly frequent as Athens struggled to maintain its military commitments while preserving its democratic institutions. The Assembly would debate whether to increase tribute demands on allied cities, impose new taxes on citizen trade, or borrow from the sacred treasuries. Each option carried political and moral implications that citizens had to weigh carefully. Higher tribute might provoke rebellion among allied cities. New taxes might burden ordinary citizens, and borrowing from the gods might invite divine displeasure. The system of liturgies created another channel for wealthy citizens to contribute to public finance. The liturgy system required the richest Athenians to fund specific public services, training dramatic choruses, outfitting warships, organizing religious festivals, or sponsoring athletic competitions. While these contributions were technically voluntary, social pressure and legal mechanisms ensured broad compliance. The assembly would debate the scope of liturgical obligations, the criteria for selection, and the standards required for performance. The triarchy, the liturgy requiring wealthy citizens to outfit and maintain warships, provides a detailed example of how this system worked. Each triarch was responsible for a specific trireme for a full year, covering the costs of maintenance, equipment, and crew wages. The assembly would debate the number of ships requiring triarchs, the financial obligations involved, and the procedures for selecting individuals for service. Citizens would argue about whether the burden was fairly distributed, whether the requirements were adequate for military needs, and how to handle cases where designated triarchs failed to fulfill their obligations. The choragic system, which required wealthy citizens to sponsor dramatic productions, illustrates the intersection of public finance and cultural life. Each year, the city's dramatic festivals required multiple choruses for tragic and comic performances. The assembly would determine how many productions to sponsor, the standards required for performance, and the criteria for selecting chorotes. These decisions affected not just the cultural life of the city, but the livelihoods of poets, actors, musicians, and craftsmen involved in theatrical production. The Assembly's debates about market regulation reveal another dimension of public finance. The agora, Athens' central marketplace, required ongoing investment in infrastructure, security, and administration. The city employed market inspectors to verify weights and measures, collected fees from vendors, and maintained the physical structures that housed commercial activity. The Assembly would debate the rates for market fees, the standards for weights and measures, and the procedures for resolving commercial disputes. These decisions affected the daily lives of both citizens and the foreigners who participated in Athenian commercial life. The harbour at Piraeus represented Athens' largest commercial asset, and its management required constant attention from the Assembly. The city collected substantial revenues from harbour fees, customs duties, and warehouse rentals. The Assembly would debate the rates for different types of cargo, the procedures for customs inspection, and the investment needed to maintain harbour facilities. They would consider the competitive implications of their policies, recognizing that excessive fees might drive trade to rival ports, while inadequate fees might fail to capture the full value of Athens' commercial advantages. The grain trade presented particular challenges for Athenian public finance. Athens, like most Greek cities, could not feed its population from local agriculture alone, and depended on grain imports from the Black Sea region, Egypt, and other distant sources. The Assembly would debate policies designed to ensure adequate food supplies, subsidies for grain importers, public stockpiles for emergencies, and diplomatic efforts to secure reliable supply relationships. These policies required balancing the immediate needs of citizens with the long-term sustainability of trade relationships. The Athenian approach to monetary policy reveals sophisticated understanding of currency and exchange. The city's silver tetradrachms, minted from Laurian silver, became the most widely accepted currency in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Assembly would debate policies affecting the currency supply, the purity standards for silver coinage, and the exchange rates with other currencies. They would consider the implications of currency policy for both domestic commerce and international trade, recognizing that monetary decisions affected Athens' economic relationships with other cities. The administration of public lands provided another source of revenue that required ongoing attention from the Assembly. Athens owned substantial agricultural land, both in Attica and in territories acquired through conquest. The city leased much of this land to private farmers, collecting rents that helped fund public expenses. The Assembly would debate leasing policies, rent levels, and the terms of agricultural contracts. They would consider the implications of their policies for food production, revenue generation, and the welfare of both citizen and non-citizen farmers. The Assembly's oversight of public officials created ongoing opportunities for citizens to influence financial administration. Every official who handled public money was subject to regular auditing, and citizens could initiate prosecutions for financial misconduct. The Assembly would hear reports from auditors, debate the adequacy of accountability mechanisms, and consider reforms to improve financial oversight. These discussions revealed the tension between the need for administrative efficiency and the democratic principle of citizen control over public resources. The court system provided another avenue for citizen involvement in financial governance. Citizens serving on juries would hear cases involving financial misconduct, contract disputes, and tax evasion. These proceedings required ordinary citizens to master complex legal and financial concepts, creating a broader base of expertise in public finance. The Assembly would debate the procedures for financial prosecutions, the penalties for different types of misconduct, and the standards of evidence required for conviction. The Athenian approach to public welfare reveals another dimension of their budgetary priorities. The city provided various forms of support for citizens facing economic hardship: food distribution during emergencies, public employment on construction projects, and stipends for participation in government. The Assembly would debate the scope of these programs, the eligibility requirements, and the funding mechanisms. These discussions reflected different conceptions of the relationship between individual responsibility and collective support. The Theorikon, a fund that provided citizens with stipends for attending dramatic festivals, illustrates the Athenian approach to cultural subsidies. Originally designed to ensure that poor citizens could afford the entrance fees for theatrical performances, the Theorikon evolved into a broader system of public support for cultural participation. The Assembly would debate the size of the fund, the criteria for distribution, and the relationship between cultural subsidies and other public expenditures. These discussions revealed the tension between the democratic ideal of equal participation and the practical constraints of limited resources. The Assembly's approach to long-term planning required citizens to balance immediate needs with future contingencies. The city maintained strategic reserves for military emergencies, invested in infrastructure projects with long-term benefits, and planned for the replacement of aging equipment and facilities. The Assembly would debate the appropriate size of reserves, the priorities for capital investment, and the mechanisms for ensuring that long-term planning didn't compromise immediate needs. The demographic composition of the Assembly affected its financial deliberations in subtle but important ways. The citizen body was composed primarily of farmers, craftsmen, and traders, with varying levels of education and financial sophistication. The wealthy citizens who spoke most frequently in Assembly debates often had the leisure time and education to master complex financial issues, while ordinary citizens might rely more on practical experience and common sense. The result was a decision-making process that combined technical expertise with democratic input, though not always in equal measure. The seasonal rhythms of Athenian life affected the assembly's financial calendar. Spring assemblies often focused on preparations for the upcoming military campaign season, with detailed debates about naval expenditures and military supplies. Summer sessions might address trade policies and harbor improvements, taking advantage of the peak season for commercial activity. Autumn assemblies often dealt with harvest-related issues and preparations for winter, while winter sessions might focus on public works projects and administrative reforms. The Assembly's relationship with allied cities created ongoing diplomatic and financial complexities. Athens had to balance its own financial needs with the political requirements of maintaining its alliance system. Excessive tribute demands might provoke rebellion, while inadequate revenues might compromise the city's ability to provide military protection. The Assembly would debate policies toward individual allied cities, considering their economic capacity, strategic importance, and political reliability. These discussions required sophisticated understanding of both domestic finance and international relations. The role of public slaves in Athenian administration created moral tensions that the Assembly had to navigate. The city employed hundreds of publicly owned slaves in various administrative roles, from record-keeping to construction work to police duties. These slaves provided essential services at relatively low cost, but their employment raised questions about the relationship between democratic governance and slave labor. The Assembly would debate policies toward public slaves, their working conditions, opportunities for manumission, and the expansion or contraction of their roles in city administration. The Assembly's debates about military policy were inseparable from discussions of public finance. Military campaigns required enormous expenditures for equipment, supplies, wages, and logistics. The Assembly would debate not just whether to undertake particular campaigns, but how to fund them and what level of military spending the city could sustain. Citizens would consider the costs of maintaining different sizes of military forces, the financial implications of various strategic options, and the relationship between military strength and fiscal sustainability. The Athenian approach to taxation reflected democratic principles while accommodating practical necessities. The city relied primarily on indirect taxes, harbor fees, market charges, and tribute from allied cities, rather than direct taxation of citizens. This approach minimized the financial burden on ordinary citizens while generating substantial revenue from commercial activity and imperial relationships. When direct taxation became necessary, the Isphora system focused on wealthy citizens, reflecting the democratic principle that those with greater resources should bear greater responsibilities. The Assembly's oversight of religious finances reveals the complex relationship between sacred and secular authority in ancient Athens. Much of the city's wealth was technically owned by the gods, particularly Athena, whose treasury was housed in the Parthenon. The Assembly could authorize borrowing from sacred funds for military emergencies, but such decisions required careful justification and eventual repayment. Citizens would debate the propriety of using sacred funds for secular purposes, the terms of repayment, and the religious implications of various financial decisions. The development of Athenian financial institutions over time reflects the city's growing sophistication in economic management. Early in the democracy's history, financial administration was relatively simple, with limited revenues and expenditures. As Athens became more prosperous and powerful, the complexity of public finance increased dramatically. The Assembly had to adapt its procedures and institutions to handle larger budgets, more complex expenditure categories, and greater accountability requirements. The physical infrastructure supporting Athenian finance was itself a subject of Assembly debate. The city maintained extensive facilities for monetary transactions, record-keeping, and financial administration. The Metroon housed public archives, the mint produced currency, and various offices collected revenues and authorized expenditures. The Assembly would debate investments in this infrastructure, considering the costs of new facilities against the benefits of improved financial administration. These discussions revealed the Athenian understanding that effective democratic governance required substantial institutional support. The training and education of citizens in financial matters occurred primarily through participation in the democratic process itself. Unlike modern democratic systems, Athens had no professional civil service or financial bureaucracy. Citizens learned about public finance by attending assembly meetings, serving in various offices, and participating in the audit process. This experiential education created a broadly informed citizenry, though it also meant that financial decisions were sometimes made by individuals with limited technical expertise. The Assembly's approach to economic development reveals sophisticated understanding of the relationship between public policy and private economic activity. Citizens would debate policies designed to promote trade, attract skilled craftsmen, encourage innovation, and maintain Athens' competitive advantages. They would consider the costs and benefits of various economic policies, the implications for different social groups, and the long-term sustainability of their economic model. The relationship between Athenian democracy and economic inequality created ongoing tensions in financial policy. While the Assembly operated on the principle of political equality among citizens, the reality of economic inequality meant that some citizens had far more influence over financial decisions than others. Wealthy citizens could afford to attend assembly meetings regularly, hire speechwriters, and build networks of political support. Poorer citizens might be constrained by the need to work for daily wages, limiting their ability to participate fully in democratic deliberations. The introduction of assembly pay in the late 5th century partially addressed this problem by providing compensation for citizens who attended meetings. However, this innovation also created new debates about the proper relationship between democratic participation and economic incentives. Some argued that pay encouraged broader participation and made democracy more inclusive. Others worried that it might attract citizens who were motivated by financial gain rather than civic duty, or that it created an unsustainable financial burden on the city. The Assembly's debates about public employment reveal another dimension of Athenian social policy. The city employed citizens in various capacities, as judges, administrators, construction workers, and military personnel. These positions provided income for citizens while serving public purposes, but they also raised questions about the appropriate scope of public employment and its relationship to private economic activity. The Assembly would debate the number of positions to be created, the wages to be paid, and the qualifications required for different types of work. The Athenian approach to international economic relations required careful coordination between financial and diplomatic policy. The city's prosperity depended on maintaining good relationships with trading partners, securing reliable sources of essential goods, and protecting commercial shipping routes. The Assembly would debate policies toward different trading partners, considering both economic and political factors. They would discuss commercial treaties, disputes over trade practices, and the military expenditures needed to protect Athenian commercial interests. The assembly's treatment of foreign merchants and craftsmen reveals the complex relationship between economic openness and political exclusion. Athens welcomed foreigners who contributed to the city's economic prosperity, but these residents, known as metics, were excluded from political participation while being subject to special taxes and obligations. The assembly would debate policies toward the metic population, considering their economic contributions, their social integration, and their potential political influence. These discussions reflected the tension between economic pragmatism and political exclusivity that characterized Athenian democracy. The role of women in Athenian economic life created another set of complexities that the assembly had to address indirectly. While women were excluded from political participation, they played essential roles in household economic management, small-scale commerce, and various crafts. The assembly's financial decisions affected women's economic opportunities and burdens, though these effects were rarely discussed explicitly in political debates. The taxation of certain goods, the regulation of markets, and the funding of religious festivals all had implications for women's economic activities. The Assembly's oversight of public festivals and cultural activities reveals the complex relationship between economic and cultural policy. Athens invested heavily in dramatic productions, athletic competitions, and religious celebrations, both for their intrinsic value and for their role in maintaining civic cohesion and international prestige. The Assembly would debate the allocation of resources among different cultural activities, the standards for public performances, and the balance between cultural investment and other public priorities. The administration of justice in financial matters required substantial public resources and careful oversight. The city maintained an extensive court system for resolving commercial disputes, prosecuting financial crimes, and auditing public officials. The Assembly would debate the resources needed for court operations, the procedures for different types of cases, and the training required for citizens serving as judges. These discussions revealed the Athenian understanding that effective financial governance required reliable legal institutions. The Assembly's approach to technological innovation in public administration shows their willingness to adapt traditional institutions to changing circumstances. As the volume and complexity of public business increased, the city experimented with new procedures for record-keeping, communication, and coordination. Citizens would debate proposals for administrative reform, considering the costs and benefits of various innovations. These discussions reflected the ongoing tension between efficiency and democratic participation in public administration. The relationship between military service and civic participation created important dynamics in assembly debates. Citizens who had served in military campaigns often had first-hand knowledge of military costs and logistics that informed their contributions to budget debates. Veterans might argue for higher military spending based on their experience of equipment failures or supply shortages, while others might question whether military expenditures were truly necessary or efficiently managed. This experiential knowledge enriched the Assembly's deliberations while also creating potential biases in favor of military spending. The Assembly's treatment of public debt reveals sophisticated understanding of fiscal responsibility and intergenerational equity. When Athens borrowed money, whether from sacred treasuries or private lenders, citizens had to consider not just the immediate benefits of the expenditure, but the long-term implications of debt service. They would debate the appropriate level of public borrowing, the terms of repayment, and the fairness of imposing debt obligations on future generations of citizens. The seasonal patterns of public finance created ongoing challenges for budget planning and resource management. Athens's revenues fluctuated predictably, with seasonal variations in trade, military activity, and agricultural production. The assembly had to plan expenditures to accommodate these fluctuations while maintaining essential services throughout the year. Citizens would debate the appropriate size of reserves, the timing of major expenditures, and the mechanisms for managing cash flow during lean periods. The Assembly's approach to public works projects illustrates the intersection of economic policy, urban planning, and civic pride. Major construction projects like the Parthenon required multi-year commitments of resources and careful coordination of various crafts and trades. The Assembly would debate not just the initial authorization for construction, but ongoing decisions about materials, workmanship standards, and completion schedules. These discussions revealed the Athenian understanding that public works served multiple purposes: religious, aesthetic, economic, and political. The development of banking and credit in Athens created new opportunities and challenges for public finance. Private bankers began to play important roles in facilitating trade, managing large transactions, and providing credit for commercial ventures. The Assembly would debate policies toward banking activities, considering the benefits of financial innovation against the risks of speculation and fraud. These discussions reflected the growing sophistication of Athenian economic life and the challenges of regulating complex financial relationships. The Assembly's oversight of public health and safety measures reveals another dimension of civic responsibility that required ongoing financial commitment. The city invested in water supplies, waste management, fire prevention, and medical care, all of which required substantial resources and careful administration. Citizens would debate the appropriate level of investment in public health infrastructure, the standards for various services, and the distribution of costs among different segments of the population. The relationship between Athenian democracy and the broader Greek world created ongoing challenges for financial policy. Athens was both a leader in the development of democratic institutions and a dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Assembly had to balance its role as a model of democratic governance with its interests as an imperial power. Financial decisions often had implications that extended far beyond Athens itself, affecting the economic and political relationships throughout the Greek world. The Assembly's approach to cultural investment reveals sophisticated understanding of the relationship between economic prosperity and artistic achievement. Athens attracted artists, philosophers, and intellectuals from throughout the Greek world, creating a cultural environment that enhanced the city's reputation and influence. The Assembly would debate the appropriate level of public support for cultural activities, recognizing that investment in the arts served both intrinsic and instrumental purposes. These discussions reflected the Athenian understanding that cultural achievement was itself a form of political and economic power. The role of religious institutions in Athenian finance created ongoing complexities that the Assembly had to navigate carefully. Temples served not just as places of worship, but as repositories of wealth, centers of economic activity, and employers of substantial numbers of citizens and slaves. The Assembly would debate policies affecting temple finances, considering both the religious obligations of the city and the economic benefits of temple activities. These discussions revealed the intricate relationship between sacred and secular authority in ancient Greek society. The Assembly's oversight of military logistics illustrates the extraordinary complexity of ancient warfare and its financial implications. Maintaining a navy of 200 triremes required not just the ships themselves, but extensive shore facilities, supply networks, training programs, and administrative systems. The assembly would debate every aspect of naval operations, from the quality of rope used in ship rigging to the nutritional standards for crew rations. Citizens had to master technical details about shipbuilding, navigation, and combat tactics in order to make informed decisions about military spending. The relationship between public finance and private enterprise created ongoing tensions that the assembly had to address. While Athens maintained substantial public ownership of key economic assets, it also relied heavily on private contractors and entrepreneurs for many services. The assembly would debate the appropriate balance between public and private provision of various services, considering factors of cost, quality, reliability, and political control. These discussions anticipated many of the debates about privatization and public-private partnerships that continue in modern democratic societies. The Assembly's treatment of environmental issues reveals early recognition of the relationship between economic activity and ecological sustainability. The silver mines at Lorient, while providing enormous wealth, also created significant environmental damage through deforestation, soil erosion, and water pollution. The Assembly would debate policies to mitigate these environmental costs, though always within the context of maintaining the economic benefits that mining provided. These discussions reflected the ongoing challenge of balancing immediate economic interests with long-term environmental sustainability. The development of Athenian commercial law required ongoing attention from the Assembly. As trade became increasingly complex and international, the city needed sophisticated legal frameworks for resolving disputes, enforcing contracts, and regulating commercial practices. The Assembly would debate reforms to commercial law, considering the needs of different trading partners and the implications for Athens' competitive position. These discussions revealed the Athenian understanding that effective legal institutions were essential for economic prosperity. The Assembly's approach to immigration and citizenship policy had important implications for public finance. Athens attracted immigrants from throughout the Mediterranean world, many of whom contributed to the city's economic prosperity while remaining excluded from political participation. The Assembly would debate policies toward immigrants, considering their economic contributions, their social integration, and the fiscal implications of their presence. These discussions reflected the ongoing tension between economic openness and political exclusivity that characterized Athenian democracy. The role of slavery in Athenian public finance created moral complexities that permeated every aspect of democratic deliberation. Slaves worked in the silver mines, served in public administration, labored on construction projects, and provided essential services throughout the city. The Assembly's financial decisions directly affected the lives of thousands of slaves, yet these individuals had no voice in the democratic process. Citizens had to find ways to reconcile their democratic ideals with their dependence on slave labor, creating ongoing tensions that were never fully resolved. The Assembly's oversight of public education reveals early recognition of the relationship between civic competence and democratic governance. While Athens had no formal system of public education, the city did invest in various forms of civic education, including dramatic performances, public lectures, and athletic competitions. The Assembly would debate the appropriate level of public support for educational activities, recognizing that an informed citizenry was essential for effective democratic governance. These discussions anticipated many of the debates about public education that continue in modern democratic societies. The seasonal rhythms of ancient life created ongoing challenges for financial planning and administration. Agricultural production, military campaigns, religious festivals, and commercial activity all followed predictable, seasonal patterns that the assembly had to accommodate in its budgetary decisions. Citizens would debate how to manage these seasonal fluctuations while maintaining essential services throughout the year. These discussions required sophisticated understanding of the relationships between natural cycles and human economic activity. The Assembly's treatment of public entertainment reveals the complex relationship between individual pleasure and collective benefit. Athens invested substantial resources in dramatic festivals, athletic competitions, and other forms of public entertainment, recognizing that these activities served important social and political functions. The Assembly would debate the appropriate balance between entertainment and other public priorities, considering both the immediate enjoyment provided to citizens and the long-term benefits for civic cohesion and cultural development. The development of Athenian political institutions required ongoing investment and adaptation. The Assembly itself, along with the courts, the administrative offices, and the various boards and committees that managed public affairs, required substantial resources for their operation. Citizens would debate reforms to these institutions, considering how to improve their effectiveness while maintaining democratic control. These discussions revealed the Athenian understanding that democratic governance required not just good intentions, but also effective institutional arrangements. The Assembly's approach to risk management shows sophisticated understanding of uncertainty and contingency planning. Ancient life was filled with unpredictable events, military attacks, natural disasters, trade disruptions, and political upheavals that could dramatically affect public finances. The Assembly would debate strategies for managing these risks, including the maintenance of strategic reserves, the diversification of revenue sources, and the development of emergency response procedures. These discussions required citizens to think systematically about the relationship between current decisions and future contingencies. The physical environment of Athens created ongoing challenges and opportunities that the Assembly had to address through financial policy. The rocky soil of Attica made agriculture challenging, requiring investment in terracing, irrigation, and soil improvement. The natural harbor at Piraeus provided commercial advantages, but also required ongoing maintenance and improvement. The marble quarries on Mount Pentelicus offered valuable building materials, but required careful management to ensure sustainable extraction. Citizens would debate how to balance the exploitation of natural resources with their conservation for future generations. The Assembly's oversight of public transportation reveals early recognition of the relationship between infrastructure and economic development. Athens maintained an extensive network of roads connecting the city to its rural territories, the harbor, and neighboring regions. These roads required ongoing maintenance, security, and improvement, all of which had to be funded through public resources. The Assembly would debate priorities for road construction and maintenance, considering both the immediate benefits for commerce and communication and the long-term implications for territorial integration and military defense. The role of festivals in Athenian public finance extended far beyond their immediate religious and cultural purposes. The Great Panathenaea, held every 4 years, attracted visitors from throughout the Greek world, generating substantial economic activity through tourism, trade, and diplomatic exchange. The Assembly would debate the appropriate level of investment in festival infrastructure, recognizing that these celebrations served important economic as well as cultural functions. Citizens had to balance the costs of magnificent celebrations against their benefits for international prestige and commercial development. The Assembly's treatment of intellectual property and innovation reveals early grappling with the relationship between individual creativity and collective benefit. Athens attracted artists, philosophers, and inventors from throughout the Mediterranean world, creating an environment that fostered innovation and cultural achievement. The Assembly would debate policies to encourage innovation while ensuring that the benefits were shared broadly among the citizen population. These discussions anticipated many of the modern debates about intellectual property, research funding, and technology transfer. The development of Athenian maritime law required ongoing attention from the Assembly. As the city's commercial interests expanded throughout the Mediterranean, Athens needed sophisticated legal frameworks for regulating shipping, resolving disputes, and protecting commercial interests. The Assembly would debate reforms to maritime law, considering the needs of Athenian merchants, the practices of other trading cities, and the implications for international relations. These discussions revealed the Athenian understanding that legal innovation was essential for maintaining commercial leadership. The Assembly's approach to urban planning illustrates the intersection of public finance, private property, and collective welfare. As Athens grew in population and prosperity, the city faced increasing challenges of housing, sanitation, traffic management, and public space. The Assembly would debate investments in urban infrastructure, considering both the immediate needs of citizens and the long-term implications for urban development. Citizens had to balance respect for private property rights with the need for collective action to address urban problems. The role of women in religious festivals created important implications for public finance that the Assembly had to address indirectly. While women were excluded from political participation, they played central roles in many religious celebrations that required substantial public funding. The Assembly would debate the appropriate level of support for women's religious activities, recognizing their importance for civic life, while maintaining the exclusion of women from political decision-making. These discussions revealed the complex ways in which gender exclusion affected democratic governance. The Assembly's oversight of public health measures shows early recognition of collective responsibility for individual welfare. Athens invested in public fountains, waste management systems, and basic medical care, recognizing that public health measures benefited everyone, regardless of individual economic status. Citizens would debate the appropriate level of investment in public health infrastructure, considering both humanitarian concerns and the economic benefits of a healthy population. These discussions anticipated many of the modern debates about public health policy and universal health care. The seasonal patterns of religious observance created ongoing challenges for financial planning. The Athenian religious calendar included dozens of festivals throughout the year, each requiring specific expenditures for sacrifices, processions, performances, and prizes. The Assembly had to coordinate these religious obligations with other public priorities, ensuring adequate funding for essential religious observances while maintaining fiscal discipline. Citizens would debate the relative importance of different festivals, the appropriate level of expenditure for each celebration, and the relationship between religious obligations and secular needs. The Assembly's treatment of commercial regulation reveals sophisticated understanding of the relationship between government policy and private economic activity. Athens maintained extensive regulations covering weights and measures, product quality, fair trading practices, and dispute resolution. The Assembly would debate reforms to commercial law, considering the needs of different trading communities, the enforcement costs of various regulations, and the implications for Athens' competitive position. These discussions reflected the Athenian understanding that effective regulation was essential for maintaining commercial prosperity. The development of banking services in Athens created new opportunities and challenges that the assembly had to address. Private bankers began to offer increasingly sophisticated financial services, including currency exchange, credit provision, and international transfers. The assembly would debate policies toward banking activities, considering the benefits of financial innovation against the risks of speculation and fraud. Citizens had to develop new frameworks for understanding and regulating complex financial relationships that had no precedent in traditional Greek society. The assembly's approach to disaster preparedness reveals practical wisdom about risk management and emergency response. Athens faced regular threats from earthquakes, fires, floods, military attacks, and disease outbreaks, all of which could disrupt normal economic activity and create emergency needs for public resources. The assembly would debate strategies for disaster preparedness, including the maintenance of emergency reserves, the development of response procedures, and the coordination of relief efforts. These discussions required citizens to think systematically about low-probability but high-impact events. The role of slaves in public administration created ongoing moral and practical complexities. Many of the skilled positions in Athenian government were filled by public slaves who possessed technical expertise and institutional knowledge. The assembly had to balance the efficiency benefits of using skilled slaves against the democratic principle of citizen control over public affairs. Citizens would debate policies toward public slaves, including their working conditions, opportunities for advancement, and the expansion or contraction of their roles in government administration. The Assembly's oversight of military procurement illustrates the extraordinary complexity of ancient warfare and its financial implications. Equipping and maintaining a large military force required sophisticated supply chains, quality control systems, and inventory management. The Assembly would debate every aspect of military procurement, from the specifications for bronze armor to the nutritional requirements for military rations. Citizens had to master technical details about metallurgy, logistics, and combat effectiveness in order to make informed decisions about military spending. The relationship between Athenian democracy and technological innovation created ongoing opportunities and challenges. Athens attracted craftsmen and inventors from throughout the Mediterranean world, creating an environment that fostered technological development. The Assembly would debate policies to encourage innovation, including public funding for research, patent-like protections for inventors, and investment in technological infrastructure. These discussions revealed the Athenian understanding that technological leadership was essential for maintaining military and economic advantages. The Assembly's treatment of public monuments and art reveals the complex relationship between aesthetic achievement and political purpose. Athens invested enormous resources in public sculpture, painting, and architecture, recognizing that artistic excellence enhanced the city's reputation and influence. The Assembly would debate the appropriate level of investment in public art, considering both the immediate costs and the long-term benefits for civic pride and international prestige. Citizens had to balance aesthetic considerations with practical priorities in ways that anticipated many modern debates about public funding for the arts. The development of professional associations and trade guilds created new dynamics that the Assembly had to address. As Athenian economic life became more specialized and complex, workers began to organize into associations that provided mutual support, quality standards, and collective bargaining power. The Assembly would debate policies toward these associations, considering their benefits for economic organization against their potential for restricting trade and limiting competition. These discussions revealed early grappling with issues of labor organization and economic regulation. The Assembly's approach to international economic relations required careful coordination between commercial interests and diplomatic priorities. Athens maintained trading relationships with cities throughout the Mediterranean world, many of which were also potential military allies or enemies. The Assembly would debate trade policies, considering both their immediate economic benefits and their implications for international relations. Citizens had to balance commercial opportunities with strategic concerns in ways that anticipated many modern debates about economic diplomacy. The role of religious sanctuaries in Athenian finance created ongoing complexities that extended far beyond the city itself. Athens controlled several important religious sites that attracted pilgrims from throughout the Greek world, generating substantial economic activity through offerings, festival attendance, and related commercial activity. The Assembly would debate policies toward these sanctuaries, considering their religious significance, their economic benefits, and their implications for international relations. These discussions revealed the complex ways in which religious authority intersected with economic and political power. The Assembly's oversight of public libraries and archives shows early recognition of the value of information and knowledge for democratic governance. Athens maintained extensive records of public proceedings, legal decisions, and administrative actions, all of which required substantial investment in storage, organization, and access systems. The Assembly would debate policies for record keeping and information management, considering both the immediate costs and the long-term benefits for accountability and institutional memory. Citizens recognized that effective democracy required not just current participation, but also historical knowledge and institutional continuity. The seasonal patterns of construction activity created ongoing challenges for public works planning. Most major construction projects in Athens were undertaken during the warmer months when weather conditions were favorable and materials could be transported more easily. The Assembly had to coordinate construction schedules with other seasonal priorities, including military campaigns, agricultural work, and religious festivals. Citizens would debate the timing and sequencing of public works projects, considering both technical constraints and competing demands for resources and labor. The Assembly's treatment of public entertainment venues reveals the intersection of cultural policy and urban development. Athens maintained several theaters, athletic facilities, and other venues for public entertainment, all of which required ongoing investment in construction, maintenance, and operation. The Assembly would debate policies toward these facilities, considering their cultural importance, their economic impact, and their role in maintaining civic cohesion. Citizens had to balance investment in entertainment infrastructure against other public priorities. The development of consumer protection policies shows early recognition of the need to regulate market relationships. Athens maintained standards for product quality, weights and measures, and fair trading practices, all of which required enforcement mechanisms and dispute resolution procedures. The Assembly would debate reforms to consumer protection policies, considering the needs of different groups of consumers and producers. These discussions revealed the Athenian understanding that effective markets required not just freedom of exchange, but also reliable regulatory frameworks. The Assembly's approach to environmental protection illustrates early grappling with the relationship between economic activity and ecological sustainability. The silver mines at Laurion, while providing enormous wealth, also created significant environmental damage that affected surrounding communities. The Assembly would debate policies to mitigate environmental damage, though always within the context of maintaining the economic benefits that mining provided. Citizens had to balance immediate economic interests with long-term environmental concerns in ways that anticipated many modern environmental debates. The role of foreign workers in Athenian economic life created ongoing policy challenges that the Assembly had to address. Athens attracted skilled craftsmen, merchants, and laborers from throughout the Mediterranean world, many of whom contributed significantly to the city's economic prosperity. The Assembly would debate policies toward foreign workers, considering their economic contributions, their social integration, and their impact on citizen employment opportunities. These discussions reflected ongoing tensions between economic openness and social cohesion. The Assembly's oversight of public ceremonies and rituals reveals the complex relationship between symbolic activity and material resources. Athens maintained an elaborate calendar of public ceremonies that required substantial expenditures for costumes, decorations, performances, and hospitality. The Assembly would debate the appropriate level of investment in ceremonial activities, considering both their importance for civic identity and their costs in terms of resources that might be used for other purposes. Citizens had to balance symbolic and material priorities in ways that reflected their understanding of the relationship between culture and politics. The development of credit and lending institutions created new opportunities and risks that the Assembly had to address. As Athenian economic life became more complex, individuals and businesses increasingly relied on borrowed funds for various purposes. The Assembly would debate policies toward lending practices, considering both the benefits of expanded credit availability and the risks of excessive debt and financial instability. These discussions revealed early grappling with issues of financial regulation and monetary policy. The Assembly's treatment of public safety measures shows recognition of collective responsibility for individual security. Athens maintained various systems for fire prevention, crime control, and emergency response, all of which required ongoing investment in personnel, equipment, and training. The Assembly would debate the appropriate level of investment in public safety, considering both the immediate benefits for citizen welfare and the long-term implications for social order and economic development. Citizens recognized that personal security was essential for both individual well-being and collective prosperity. The role of competitive athletics in Athenian public life created important implications for public finance. Athens sponsored various athletic competitions that required substantial expenditures for facilities, prizes, and organization. The Assembly would debate the appropriate level of investment in athletic activities, considering their benefits for physical fitness, social cohesion, and international prestige. These discussions revealed the Athenian understanding that physical culture was an important component of civic life that deserved public support. As the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows across the Pnyx, and the Assembly's deliberations drew toward their close, citizens would find themselves contemplating the extraordinary complexity of the democratic process they had just experienced. They had spent hours debating minute details of public expenditure, weighing competing priorities, and making decisions that would affect not just their own lives, but the lives of thousands of others. The responsibility was enormous, the process demanding, and the results uncertain. Yet they had participated in something remarkable, a form of government that gave ordinary citizens direct control over the most fundamental aspects of collective life. The physical act of voting would conclude the day's proceedings, but the implications of their decisions would extend far into the future. The naval budget they had approved would determine the safety of merchant ships throughout the Aegean. The festival allocations they had authorized would provide employment and entertainment for countless individuals. The construction projects they had funded would shape the physical environment of their city for generations to come. The tribute assessments they had confirmed would affect the political and economic relationships throughout the Greek world. As citizens began to make their way home through the narrow streets of Athens, they carried with them not just the satisfaction of democratic participation, but also the weight of collective responsibility. The farmer walking back to his fields had helped decide the naval policy that would protect the grain ships on which the city depended. The craftsman, returning to his workshop, had contributed to decisions about public works projects that would provide employment for his fellow artisans. The merchant heading toward the agora had participated in discussions about trade policies that would affect his own commercial relationships. The conversations would continue in homes, workshops, and public spaces throughout the city. Citizens would discuss the day's decisions with family members, neighbors, and business associates. They would explain the reasoning behind various votes, debate alternative approaches that might have been taken, and consider the likely consequences of the choices they had made. This ongoing dialogue was itself an essential part of the democratic process, creating a broader understanding of public issues and building support for collective decisions. The slaves who had observed the proceedings from the edges of the assembly space would return to their quarters with their own perspectives on the day's events. They had heard debates about expenditures that would directly affect their working conditions, their living circumstances, and their future prospects. Yet they had no voice in these decisions, no vote in the democratic process, no formal recognition of their contributions to the city's prosperity. The contradiction between democratic ideals and slave reality was stark and undeniable, yet it was one that Athenian citizens had learned to live with. The women of Athens, likewise excluded from the assembly, would learn about its decisions through their male relatives and neighbors. The budget allocations for religious festivals would affect their participation in civic life. The expenditures on public infrastructure would influence their daily activities. The military appropriations would determine whether their husbands and sons would be called to military service. Yet, like the slaves, they had no direct voice in the democratic process that shaped these fundamental aspects of their lives. The foreign residents of Athens, the metics who contributed so much to the city's economic vitality, would also feel the effects of the assembly's decisions without having participated in making them. The policies toward trade and commerce would affect their business opportunities. The regulations on markets and harbors would influence their daily work. The expenditures on public facilities would determine the quality of infrastructure they could access. Yet they remained outside the circle of political participation, contributing to the city's prosperity while being excluded from its governance. As evening approached and the city settled into its nighttime rhythms, the machinery of Athenian finance would continue to operate. The officials responsible for implementing the assembly's decisions would begin the complex process of translation from democratic authorization to administrative action. The treasurers would adjust their accounts to reflect new spending priorities. The purchasing agents would begin procurement processes for authorized expenditures. The tax collectors would implement any new revenue measures that had been approved. The international implications of the Assembly's decisions would ripple outward across the Mediterranean world. Allied cities would learn of new tribute assessments and adjust their own budgets accordingly. Trading partners would respond to changes in commercial policies. Military opponents would factor Athenian expenditure decisions into their own strategic planning. The democratic process that had unfolded on a hillside in Athens would have consequences that extended far beyond the city's borders. The moral complexities of Athenian democracy would continue to challenge thoughtful citizens as they reflected on the day's proceedings. They had participated in a remarkable experiment in collective self-governance, yet they had also perpetuated systems of exclusion and exploitation that contradicted their democratic ideals. They had demonstrated the capacity of ordinary citizens to engage with complex issues and make difficult decisions. Yet they had also revealed the limitations of democratic institutions when they are built on foundations of inequality and injustice. The educational dimension of the democratic process would continue to unfold in the days and weeks following the assembly meeting. Citizens who had learned about naval logistics during the military budget debate would carry that knowledge into future discussions. Those who had mastered the complexities of tribute assessment would be better equipped to participate in future debates about imperial policy. The experiential education provided by democratic participation would gradually create a more informed and sophisticated citizenry. The seasonal rhythms of Athenian life would continue to shape the ongoing cycle of democratic governance. Spring would bring new military preparations and fresh debates about campaign funding. Summer would see the implementation of construction projects authorized by the Assembly. Autumn would bring harvest considerations and planning for winter needs. Winter would provide opportunities for administrative reform and preparation for the following year's challenges. The legacy of this day's democratic deliberations would extend far beyond the immediate implementation of specific policies. The precedents established, the procedures refined, and the principles articulated would influence future generations of Athenian citizens as they grappled with their own versions of the same fundamental challenges. The ongoing experiment in democratic governance would continue to evolve, adapting to new circumstances while maintaining its core commitment to citizen participation in collective decision-making. As you settle deeper into rest tonight, let your mind drift back to those ancient hillsides where ordinary citizens gathered to exercise extraordinary responsibility. Picture the morning light filtering through olive branches as farmers and craftsmen made their way toward the Pnyx. Feel the weight of democratic participation as citizens debated complex issues that would affect thousands of lives. Hear the voices of ancient democracy as they grappled with questions that remain central to human governance. The Athenian experiment in democratic finance offers us both inspiration and caution. It demonstrates the remarkable capacity of ordinary citizens to engage with complex issues when given the opportunity and the tools to do so. It shows the power of transparency and accountability in maintaining public trust. It reveals the importance of connecting individual participation to collective outcomes. Yet it also reminds us that democratic institutions can coexist with significant inequalities and injustices, and that formal procedures do not automatically guarantee just outcomes. The voices of those ancient citizens still echo across the centuries, reminding us that democracy is not a destination, but a journey, not a fixed system, but a continuous process of learning and adaptation. Their struggles with fundamental questions of governance, how to balance competing interests, how to ensure accountability while maintaining efficiency, how to preserve democratic values while addressing practical constraints, remain as relevant today as they were 2,500 years ago. Rest now in the knowledge that the democratic ideals debated on the Pnyx continue to evolve and develop in our own time. The citizens who gathered on that hillside were part of an ongoing conversation about how human beings can govern themselves wisely and justly. Their example reminds us that democracy requires not just institutions and procedures, but the active participation of informed and engaged citizens who are willing to invest their time and energy in the patient work of self-governance. Let the gentle rhythm of history carry you toward peaceful sleep, knowing that the questions they debated about justice and efficiency, about individual rights and collective responsibilities, about the proper relationship between wealth and power, continue to challenge and inspire democratic societies around the world. Their legacy lives on in every citizen who takes seriously the responsibility of democratic participation, in every community that strives to govern itself wisely, and in every society that seeks to balance the competing demands of freedom and order, equality and excellence, idealism and pragmatism. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the timeless ideals of democratic participation, the careful weighing of competing interests, and the eternal human quest for wisdom, justice, and prosperity in the governance of our common life.